All right, everybody. Welcome back to a new episode of Riftbound 101 in a somewhat refreshed studio. I'm still in the same room, just reorganized some stuff around to see if the space works a bit better, if the sound sounds better, and started fiddling around with some video and sound options. So hopefully things are going to get even better from now on, and the videos are going to be a breeze to listen to and to watch. Today's topic is speed and positions. This is going to be a combo episode of a couple of different things that a few viewers have requested, and it's going to wade through a little bit of TCG history going back to 1999. But really, this is going to be an episode about gameplay, about on the fly decision making, and about understanding what it is that your deck wants to do and what it is that your opponent's deck wants to do. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the Las Vegas regional qualifier that just happened, and particularly the top eight and some specific screenshots. So it's not going to be a VOD review, although that might happen at some point in the future. This is just like an experiment. And if you are one of the players who was in those videos and you're ever watching this video, I apologize if I misread your intentions or what's happening. So, the five sort of key topics for today are going to be speed, so understanding what your goals are, what your your deck's goals are, and what that means for the deck speed. Then it's going to be talking about position, so where are you relative to your speed and what you want to do. And then risk, so when to roll the dice, when do you take risk, when do you not take risk. And then finally, I want to talk about quadrants and quadrant theory, which is something that's been around Magic for a while, at least going as far back as 2014, I think, in a big way. And then finally, mirror matches, which are, I think, one of the most difficult matchups to discuss, to assess, especially when decks get super complicated. And today's color themes, they always change these. I'm in a very spring mood. It's super sunny out. It's really warm in Montreal, so we've got some greenery. I'm trying to like spruce things up a little bit, at least visually. Okay, so speed. Speed is a topic that is really iffy to talk about because I think people are going to have very different expectations and very different reads. So this is mine. And I know this was a topic I covered, I think, in my first video I ever made for the channel. And it caused some criticism, which I think is legitimate. And I want to rectify or at least expand on how I approach speed and what I think is really useful in Riftbound. So, speed is often relative, and understanding what speed looks like in Riftbound is different to other games, right? So, if you think about speed outside of game worlds, speed is often understood as an absolute. And if there are any like physicists, I'm really sorry. This is going to be like a total butchering of physics. But let's say you're thinking about speed in a metric system. You can think about a car going from 0 kilometers an hour to 100 kilometers an hour, or like 60 miles an hour. And that's an absolute speed, right? From standing still to going 100 kilometers an hour, it's an absolute change. So there's a progression. But if I show you something that's a bit more relative, like 50 kilometers an hour or 100 kilometers an hour, those are both speeds that are non-zero, but they're quite different, right? You are doing different things. You're probably traveling through different neighborhoods or highways, and you are probably engaging with the world around you in a completely different way, right? If you're driving 50 kilometers an hour, you're probably like in a city. If you're driving 30, you're like in a school zone. It's even slower. It can feel super slow. And then, if you're like 10 or below, you're probably parking the car. So speeds are relative. We don't experience them in absolutes. And if you are somebody who drives a lot, you might know how this feels, right? When you're driving at a certain speed for a really long time and you change, the speed changes. And this is like a real world assessment of speed, but speed exists in card games as well. And when we talk about speed in card games, we tend to talk about slow or fast. We don't really talk about like standing still, which is effectively like being dead in the water, or like extremely slow. We use these as somewhat absolute measurements, but they are relative in themselves, right? So what's fast in Riftbound, for example, changes over time. So it changed from playtesting of the game, I'm sure, to set 1 to set 2, as has what counts as slow, and maybe some things that were slow in set 1 are now extremely slow by comparison. This is usually like a way to move from talking about absolute speed to relative speed. But we tend to not graph this from slow to fast. We tend to graph it from fast to slow, right? And that's a big change in terms of how we experience or, graph speed. And that's because we're not thinking about your deck moving at a certain speed. We're thinking about how fast does the game end. So a game that ends quickly, ends in less turns, will be graphed as fast. A game that ends in many, many turns is going to be graphed as slow. And so we tend to go from 0 to, I don't know, 10 turns, for example. And if you play Magic and you look at websites like 17 Lands that track game speed, you're going to see a lot of the kinds of graphs that actually are tracking like format speed, right? Now, if you map on deck speeds to the card game speed, this is where you start to see, the old binary of aggro and control. So aggro is a fast deck. It tends to end the game as soon as possible. And there's a lot of things to talk about with aggro. We can talk about unit-based aggro. We can talk about burn. We can talk about tempo, which is slightly slower than pure aggro, but still like very aggressive. And in control, we can talk about spell control. We can talk about aurora. We can talk about victor control. Like these are all control archetypes. They play differently, but they have relative speeds, right? Like victor control or lux control tend to end the game very slowly, incrementally. And so what you do when you're playing at these speeds is quite different. When you're playing aggressively, you're trying to end the game as quickly as possible. You put in all your resources. You are trying to develop your board. You're trying to score points. And the game currently really only plays, I would say, like the fastest game would be something like your turn 4 or 5. There are cards that can end the game faster. Cards like Ride the Wind, cards like Relentless Pursuit, cards like Tryndamere, or Purple Draven, or Purple Yasuo. These cards are not super played, so something like Triforce might end the game, but those are played in controlling decks. Meanwhile, games can go very long, and we'll talk about why that can happen. But this is to give you an idea, right? How you move from absolute speed to relative speed to understanding deck speed. Now, when you're thinking about the midway point between these, you get mid-range. And you may have heard this term floated around a lot. If you're somebody who plays a lot of card games, I don't think this is like a surprise. But if you're newer to Riftbound, you might be, trying to understand what mid-range means. And mid-range really just means the midpoint between aggro and control. Often mid-range will give up the strongest suits of either the aggressive decks, which is super assertive plays and pressure, or the massive value engines or draw spells that control has, in order to have a little bit of both and have good units at the mid game. And so it's kind of like your mid speed, right? This is like your 0, or like control is like you're moving through your neighborhood at like 30 kilometers an hour to avoid an accident. Aggro is like you're going 150 miles on the highway, and mid range is like you're driving at a reasonable pace and you're not like stressed out. So this is sort of how you map out like the base axis of speed. There is something else to talk about, though, that I didn't talk about in any of the other videos before, which is linearity. And this, you tend to not hear linear and nonlinear as much when you're looking at people discussing decks, but they are very present concepts. And so linear decks tend to accrue value or lose value at very stable intervals, right? Think of something like Azir. Azir plays 1 equipment and probably 1 Sand Soldier a turn, and he will only produce exponential power spikes when you're playing something like Arise, where you produce exponential amounts of Sand Soldiers the more gear you have. Now, there are a lot of nonlinear, unfair decks. So when you hear somebody say, well, like Draven or Miracle strategies are unfair decks, it's because they tend to compound and produce a ton of value. Whereas a lot of the yellow, orange, and green combos tend to be more linear in nature. Kaisa, for all of its faults, I think is generally a fair linear deck, with the exception of when you do something like play Time Warp, which compacts the amount of game time your opponent has and effectively creates like a nonlinear unfair window. So a lot of decks tend to have like fair game plans or fair plus like one burst of nonlinear gameplay, and this is something that you might see more as like a vertical axis, right? So it goes from like really controlled to uncontrolled. When you combine both of these, this is how you get to the traditional, card game aggro control combo triangle. And I talked about this in the first video, but you could think of combo as something that tries to end the game at the opportune time, so on its own terms rather than on a linear clock, and often matched with pieces that will do absolutely nothing by themselves or very little, and then when combined together will produce like extreme bursts of value. So this is like your pace, right? And combo doesn't really slot into the fast slow situation if it's pure, but there are decks that are on these axes on the lines and not in the corners. These are like extreme versions of this. So something that I would say, you can find articles from Magic, from people like Colin Woods from like 2017, 2018. You'll see the rise of terms like prison control, which is sort of like a control deck that tries to assemble a combo engine that just like locks the game. So for example, one of the super well-known ones in Magic is like a combo deck where there's a card that allows people to only play one card a turn and another card that counters the first card your opponents play every turn. So you've effectively like locked them out. But until that point, it plays mostly like a control deck. So Prison, I think, really fits there. Mid-range, we talked about. You could argue that tempo is somewhere between aggro and mid-range. And I really don't want to get into the discussion of like tempo and value as vectors. I'm talking about like the common usage of the term tempo decks. And then aggro combo is really the only one that is kind of the odd man out without like a pithy catch name. The discussion has been that aggro and combo tend to have very little interaction in general. Combo wants to really devote as much as possible to its combo engine, and aggro wants to compress pressure as much as possible. So aggro combo decks exist. They're just really rare. And I think there's like one that we can identify maybe in Riftbound right now. So these are all vectors of, or they're deck archetypes that sit on a certain correlation of speed and nonlinearity. And you might be trying to fit in certain decks that you've seen over Vegas, over Bologna, over all these events into this sort of schema. So let me help you out. And again, this is my assessment. So, try not to hate me too much for this. But I would say aggro decks are actually like pretty few and far in between right now in Riftbound. I was going to say in Runeterra. There's really only Rek'Sai, and especially the Rek'Sai that Vuz was piloting, the mono yellow Rek'Sai, I think is like the best version of this. Plays something like Seal and Vanguard Captain, which is like the what Draven was doing in set 1. So this is like your premier aggro deck, and there's not really that many. Then you have your key control decks, your Auroras that are still lying around. You like linearly ramp your resources until you play Aurora, and then Aurora craps out 1 unit a turn. Victor and Lux, especially the heavy spell versions, will tend to chip away at value that your opponents have to increase the gap. And then I'm not even going to put combo, I'm just going to put Miracle. Because really, there are not many combo decks currently, or pure combo decks, but I think Miracle is certainly the best exemplar of that, at least for what it looks like currently in Riftbound, and that might change in the future. One of the big indicators of this was when Miracle shells were starting to get, like mocked up. People were posting a lot of pictures of Exodia from Yu-Gi-Oh! And it was like Called Shot, Stack Deck, Ezreal, Rasa, and Seal of Discord. And that was like your Exodia Miracle engine. And combos can be open-ended, but they can also be closed. I think in the case of Miracle, it's quite open-ended because it's a lot of cheap draw spells, discounts, and payoff engines. And You could probably place, Miracle Draven for sure, Miracle Sivir, Miracle Jinx is we could have some discussions about, and now we have like Miracle Annie too. Basically anything that's like purple, tends to touch Miracle. I would put Miracle Ezreal, the Alan ZQ version, somewhere between combo and control, mostly because to me that deck feels like it is assembling parts of a combo engine, but it is trying to effectively lock you in with optionality. So that deck tends to answer everything that you do by virtue of having assembled this engine. And you're slowly petering out as you try to play cards into Vex, for example, right? So the deck doesn't totally lock you out, but by virtue of having all these resources assembled, you like slowly lose pace. Irelia, I think, is also in here a bit differently, probably a bit, depending on the version, more towards control than combo. But we can have a discussion about that. Lucian is the aggro combo deck for me, especially Spear Triforce is the sort of, for me, it's like the only aggro combo. And what happens is it tends to compact a couple more points into its aggro engine. Now you could say like that's just aggro, but the way that you have to draw those cards feels combo-y to me. And you can see the problems with like something like Spear Triforce Lucian is that those two parts of the deck don't always play well. And ideally, you would want something that would support like pure aggro Lucian and something that would be much more geared towards assembling Spear Triforce and putting it online and protecting it as much as possible. So that kind of plays like two semi-disparate game plans that sometimes will work out and sometimes won't work out. Jax and Kaisa. So Jax, I think, is kind of a quintessential like mid-range deck. Play like your 4 or 5 cost units, protect them with Counter-Strike, with a bunch of equipment. And Kaisa, I think, for a very long time was sort of my template for like a tempo deck. I think now it plays much more like a control deck, especially the Spawn Camp Kaisa. And then I suppose I'm missing Fiora and Azir. So Fiora, I would say probably tempo, and Azir almost certainly aggro in my brain, with maybe like a small push towards the combo axis. And at the middle of all this, I think we have Draven. And Draven is, to my mind, what sort of a all-arounder perfect deck looks like currently. It has no commitments to being hyper aggressive, hyper controlling, or building engines, and yet it can do all three reasonably well. Evidently, if you're playing Miracle Draven, you're all in. But there were many decks this weekend that were either half Miracle and half mid range, or Miracle with some Ferris Forerunners, or some like the Rek'Sai Breachers that we saw. And Draven does play for aggressive starts, so you're playing your 2 drops and you're sort of setting up removal, and you're holding on to things like Rebuke and Spinning Axe. But you can also slow down and start controlling the board with things like Ferris Forerunner and aforementioned removal, and also things like Mind Splitter to thin out your opponent's hand. This should be an indication why I think that Draven is a problem, or at least purple-red is a problem. And, I'm not going to wade into the discussion too much of what should be done for now, but I would recommend you watch other creators, because I think most people are on a similar train, in terms of like purple probably needing a touch somewhere. Essentially, you should never want the top deck to be a deck in the middle like this, because it means that it becomes like the bouncer of the entire metagame. Anyways, these are, I think, like very quick and dirty approaches to thinking about speed. And thinking about speed, I think, is really important to understand how you're supposed to play the game and what you're supposed to do and what your positions look like. So speed is hard to graph, and this is why I'm like, preemptively a bit defensive that somebody might watch this and say, well, you're wrong. This deck is actually tempo. This deck is actually control, partially because these speeds change, but I think it's a useful heuristic to understand, what your deck is doing. Like generally, if you are playing Azir, you will not enjoy seeing hyper controlling decks that just destroy all of your units, because pace is mismatched, right? So the reason why I mentioned speed is to talk about position. And position is something that I would describe as, like if you're thinking about Star Wars, it's having the high ground is the dominant position. But it's in card games, it's more about understanding how far you are from closing the game on the opponent. You might hear terms like turning the corner or slamming the door shut or closing the gap. Like these are all expressions that are about position. And position is an assessment of your like speed and how far you are from winning the game versus your opponent's speed. And so positions are hard to gauge because there are so many different decks and decks are built differently. I think for me, the person who is like the luminary thinking about speed was Michael Flores, or is Michael Flores. He's alive, and Flores was around the Magic Pro scene in around '96, but has really become one of the uh, longest serving writers of competitive TCGs. And his article, "Who's the Beatdown" from 1999, from I think the Dojo magazine, is maybe like the article about this, right? And the way he sees it is that a lot of game losses come from misassignment of who is the beatdown, who is the aggressor, who has the faster pace of play. Um, and if you align yourself properly, you're more likely to win. And if you align yourself improperly, you're likely to lose, right? This is the primary thing. And you can try some exercises to see how misalignment can work. Now, the other thing to think about when you're thinking about position and trying to align your plays to your pace of like the pace of your deck or the pace of your strategy, is to understand how certain speeds win the game. So aggressive decks are in good position when they're about to end the game, when they're high on points and they've optimized all their resources. Controlling decks are in winning positions when they've exhausted all their opponent's answers and they have more tools than their opponents. And combo decks tend to be in the dominant position once they assemble the engine. Mid-range decks, which sit kind of between all of these, or most often between aggressive and controlling decks, tend to win by finding edges. So trading profitably and getting either more cards out of the trades, more units, more points, or more resources, and slowly accruing those. So if you look at a couple of the matches from this weekend, and the VODs are up on the Riftbound official channel, you can see sometimes, who is in what position if you actually pay a lot of attention, and you're going to understand why the matches shake out the way they do. So, for example, in round 4 of 8, on day 1, you have this on-camera match between Codeman Jack and HD300. Codeman Jack on Azir and on Arena's Greatest for match 3, or match 2, sorry, and HD300 on Aurelia and Sunken Temple. And they're 7-7, right? So theoretically, you could imagine that the aggressive deck is about to close the game because he's super close on points. But if you start to take a look at the board, you're going to understand that this is like actually super risky. So HD300 is on a battlefield, is about to hold it to win the game. And because of previous plays, Codeman Jack has effectively no runes and almost no cards in hand and is looking for specific answers. So yeah, he has big units. They're on board. He has a hidden card at Sunken Temple. And he had a pretty aggressive start with Arena's Greatest. But the game can't close, right? So H2300 takes this round, and it's pretty clear, like at a glance, who is playing a more aggressive deck and who's playing a more controlling deck, because Azir is so happy to, or is capable of, going down on resources to this extent, while Aurelia just sticks around on a ton of resources and plays a super close to the vest match, right? So the point total looks the same, and in fact, the aggressive player looks like he's about to win. But in this kind of assessment, the Aurelia player is actually in a better position. And in this case, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a case of misalignment of the roles. I think it's just a question of the aggressive deck didn't get to close the game before the controlling player did, and the controlling player is forcing the aggressive player into a slower pace of game. So you're actually misaligning your opponent's speed so that they can't win. Another match that I think is super cool to look at and kind of crazy, really, is the Billionaire and Randy matchup. Billionaire Anton, who's from Challenger TCG, so shout out to the boys. But Anton has this sequence where off of Aurora he flips Dead Bloom into then playing a Dead Bloom and then flipping another Dead Bloom. And this is a board where you would imagine as an Aurora player, like you're ironclad, right? Like you are on 2 points, but the game will not end next turn because you're on Aspirant's Climb, and your opponent has to produce a ton of might to push you off those battlefields, 10 on each battlefield. And they're on Miracle Draven, which you can tell because of the Ezreal and the Seal, and Randy's at 6 points. So what is interesting here is, and I'm not going to spoil what the match, where the match goes, but this is the kind of board state that gets more difficult to read because your opponent has significant point lead. You have a good board, but they don't have a small board either, and you are tapped out, but they have a ton of resources. So here we have a control versus combo matchup, and the issue is if things are played linearly, the Miracle player would probably lose, but because it's a combo deck, you have to imagine that at any point your opponent can spike a ton of value on the board. And Randy's on 5 cards in hand, and if he wins any combats, he's also going to get to draw and draw off of Zons. So the situation here is that the control deck has to sort of try to lock in the combo player, and combo players tend to go over control players, given the resources and the latitude. Another round that I think is pretty cool and really worthy of almost being a finals is the Colin Kaiser Alan ZQ match. Colin also from Challenger TCG, so a fantastic showcase from a stable of players. And in match one, you're looking at this board, if you're me or you're somebody who doesn't play Miracle, and you realize in fact just how difficult it is to understand who is the beatdown player, who is the aggressor and who is going slower, because Miracle Draven is, out and out a combo deck, and Miracle Ezreal is sort of like a combo control deck. So theoretically, Ezreal might be more favored, but there are so many lines and there's so much math to do here that it's actually impossible for me as a viewer to fully figure out what's happening. As Ezreal's on more resources, but has a much smaller board, right? So 2 Fizzes, 1 Vex, 1 Ezreal, and 1 Rasa, to the Ezreal and 2 Rasa with Spinning Axe, and the resource situation or seal situation is somewhat similar, but this can get out of control very fast. So, these are the kinds of matchups that are just really hard to understand. And you can also, have an inkling of things like there are 2 Fizzes on board and there's 1 Rebuke in the graveyard. So it's less likely, for example, that the controlling deck will access another Rebuke readily, right? You would need 3rd Fizz or 2nd Rebuke, and you're already going through a bunch of these. Or I suppose Arcane Shift on the Fizzes. So again, I'm trying to not spoil the matches as much as possible. And lastly, I think another match that is difficult to really gauge in a different way is something like Very Best Gamer and Sam Sherman's round 1 match, where they're 6-6, and Sam Sherman has about 15 might on board between the Ferris Forerunner, the Noxus Hopeful, and the Bryn. But the Jax player has 2 pieces of equipment onto the Jax. The Lucian is buffed, and the Stalcorn's also around, and there's an Akshan in the back. The real indicator here that is, there's trouble brewing is that the Jax player is fairly tapped out and on 3 cards, and you can see that the Draven player is on stack deck, right? So here, the situation is somewhat close, but there is a high likelihood that the Draven player is just going to accelerate a lot of card draw and just outvalue the opponent. So even though the point total is the same, so you would say they're equal on position, I would actually say that Sam is much more favored, largely because There's actually some value hidden in the Ferris. If it dies, it comes back as 2 units that can conquer. There's card draw, and if for any reason he wins combats, then he also starts drawing more cards, right? So this is the kind of math that you have to do when you're playing at your locals or when you're going to competitive events. You're trying to figure out what it is that you're actually supposed to do and what pace you're supposed to play at. And the last one that I wanted to show you for this section was the sort of like miracle into mid-range matchup, which can be really difficult to figure out. Like if you look at Prismat's graveyard, it's just ginormous. Like there's just so many cards that have been churned through, which makes the deck incredibly consistent. But Teco Teco is at 7 points here, and there have been like two Mind Splitters played. However, with only 2 runes up and a hidden card, Teco Teco is probably, and I can't remember exactly because I took these slides a couple days ago, I think like Rebuke and Foff. So like 14 might and 3 pushbacks, right? And if for whatever reason Prismat can push through that, he can sort of unclog the board, and then things get like really bad for Teco Teco. So some matchups are just very hard to figure out because decks will become non-linear, right? And I think Draven's massive strength is that even default Draven I consider to be a somewhat non-linear deck because he draws constantly, right? So he turns every combat, every spell that he's using in that combat into potential card draw, and that effectively is producing like non-linear value, right? You're not just getting the point or just some resources, you're getting the points and cards. So these are some case studies to showcase to you that there are in fact no absolute positions, right? It's almost impossible in a card game to be at your 0 km/h position. And so what you're trying to understand is what you are doing relative to where you want to be at and what your opponent is doing relative to you and vice versa. So you're constantly trying to triangulate like 3 things. The 8-point marker or the 9-point marker if Aspirants is in play, or 7 points theoretically if it's Arena's Greatest, which is like your fixed point, and then your speed and your opponent's speed. And if you understand all these 3 things and you can align your role and misalign your opponent's role or hope that your opponent misaligns themselves, then you're like in a winning position. Okay. Risk. Risk is another thing to talk about relative to position. So we often talk about this as being ahead or being behind. And that means that you are ahead of your opponent or behind your opponent, or that your strategy is wholesale behind or ahead of your opponent. And this allows you to figure out how to realign your position relative to where you want to be at. So I mentioned, or I showcased the Azir Aurelia match from day one. And you might look at this and say, well, why is Codeman Jack only at 1 rune? And if you go watch that sequence, what's happening is that Codeman Jack is about to lose the game, and he's trying to find any kind of answer to dislodge the Stella Corn and kind of like mow through a bunch of interaction that's probably in hand. There are not a lot of answers, and really Codeman is just burning through runes trying to find as many as possible. And this is like a key way of understanding how to play from behind, or when you're trying to realign, right? You're trying to get back to your winning point. What's happening here is the behind ahead equation. So when you're behind in a linear race, you're going to lose. So what you have to do is produce non-linear plays as much as possible to catch back up. And generally when you do this, you're going to imagine all the possible answers that your opponent has, and you're going to think about the ones that you just can't do anything about and the ones that you can do something about, right? The ones that you can't do anything about are automatic losses. You don't even consider them, because even if they exist or they don't, it doesn't really matter. As soon as they're played, you have lost. So you have to act as though they don't exist, period. And when you're ahead, you do the opposite. You are in a position where if the game is linear, you're going to win unless your opponent does something risky. So you have to set up plays where you're considering what your opponent might do to catch back up. And this is really trying to realign to your, who's the beatdown sort of speed, or preventing your opponent from realigning if they're off kilter. The big thing in this is the nonlinear case, right? So if you are playing a nonlinear deck, your position might look behind, but it might not be. And this is often the case with decks that can spike a ton of points out of nowhere. This is sort of what happens when Lucian decks get very online at weird points, where you're like, oh, they're like at, like 2 points and I can't do anything. And all of a sudden it's like Spear Triforce onto the Lucian. You send into one space, and then you go into the other with Relentless Pursuit, and you've scored 4 points. And then you move back to base, right? And all of a sudden, your opponents produce like 4 points out of nowhere. They can go from 4 to 8. In some cases, you can also like Relentless Pursuit first, which will send your Lucian into a battlefield. You conquer for 2, you come back, you go to the other one, you conquer for 2, and then you hold for 2 because of the Triforce, and you've gone from 2 to 6 if you're, or from 2 to 8 if your opponent's off kilter. So nonlinearity brute forces these like ahead behind cases, and you need to understand if you are on a nonlinear deck or your opponent is on a nonlinear deck, what's going to happen. Now, the super complicated scenario that I'm not going to talk about so much today is if you're both on nonlinear decks, what happens? And the answer is almost impossible to calculate math. There's often cases where miracle decks will try to deck out the opponent to produce points for yourself because of the amount of draw. So there's some like very weird stuff that can happen that I'm not sure I'm a fan of being in the game. And what I think is just important to understand about this is just like as a golden rule, if you're ahead, you understand that you have to play safe to preserve your point lead, and if you're behind, you try to find out how to catch up. You take risks, but what's really important is understanding where you are. So a good example is if you're playing Aurora and your opponent's like 4-0 out of on a Aspirant's Climb game, you understand that you have about 3 turns, and if you play your ginormous units, you can stabilize, right? So don't be stressed out. But if you're playing an aggressive deck and your opponent's 4-0 on you, you're probably like very far behind. So it's all a question of like assessing what's happening constantly. The other aspect of this that I want to talk about is quadrant theory. So quadrant theory is something that comes out of the Limited Resources podcast, and I'm more aware of it because of Marshall Sutcliffe, but it's actually a technique or a heuristic that was developed by his former podcast host, whose name escapes me right now, and I feel really bad because it's actually in the article, but I was editing this stuff and I forgot. So quadrant theory is a way to understand cards in terms of what their roles are in the game. And this ties into being ahead or being behind and speed. This article is really, I think, about limited, but you can apply this heuristic to constructed, and I think you're going to understand what tools you're looking for. So this is kind of like a right hammer for the right nail, or right screwdriver. There are 4 quadrants: opening and developing, which we can just call developing if we'd like, winning, losing, and at parity, or tied or stalemated. These are not necessarily like graphed in a specific order. I'm sure we could find a way to like justify positioning them in one way, but for today, just think about them as 4 like different buckets that you can put cards in, and some cards are going to fit in more than one bucket, often the case. And so the cards are really suited for the kinds of functions that they have. So opening, developing, this is when players are progressing the early game state, relatively few resources to position. So like 2 runes, 4 runes, that kind of stuff. Winning is the position that we talked about when you're ahead. If nothing changes, you win the game. And losing, if nothing changes, you lose the game. So this is your traditional ahead and behind. Parity is the game state that is much harder to read. So this is when you've stalled with your opponent and you either can't commit or the resources are dried out. When you're top decking, this is the case. When you're locked into some weird sequences where your opponent has answers, so you can't use your card, but your opponent can use the answers because they know they're going to have to use it on yours. These are situations at parity. And I think this is where the game gets the most difficult to understand or to map out going forward, right? So if you're trying to align yourself, this is where things get a bit weird. If you think about like the game position, you can understand if you're behind, ahead, at parity, or if you're trying to sort of figure out what you want to do and especially like what tools you need at any time. So I'm going to talk about like some specific cases where you want to understand the the quadrants heuristic or the quadrants categories, but understand that like there are cards that are suited for specific things, right? If you are behind, you probably don't want like a 2-drop that doesn't do anything, and if you're ahead, you probably want certain kinds of answers too. So cards have functions, and instead of thinking of your deck as just an assortment of cool cards that have like a sick look or it's the hero that you really like, you should be thinking about these as tools for the right job, right? They are around to do certain things, and then you're going to have to figure out what those things are. So the last thing I want to talk about for today is mirror matches. Mirrors are by far the most intensive skill matches, and until you've played a tournament where you're playing a ton of mirrors, let me tell you, your brain has not been on fire as much. Because in a mirror, it's really hard to figure out who is aligned to the beatdown role and who is aligned to the controlling role. This is like the case that Mike Flores talks about. So if you look at the top 8 bracket from Vegas, something gets like really scary here, right? Where in a situation where Draven is so dominant, you have to play a lot of mirror matches. And playing mirror matches is really hard and annoying. And some of these are not like pure mirror matches. So something like Shizzle and Sam's match is a pure mirror match because it's two mid-range Ravens. But Sam and TTA's finals match is actually a Draven versus Miracle Draven mirror. So it's functionally a mirror because it's Draven v Draven, but it's actually like not really a mirror because they play pretty differently. And so your capacity to understand the speed is going to vary quite differently. In that 1999 article, Mike Flores talks about like, the true mirror match is the hardest of all because then the dilemma is who is actually supposed to play what role is really hard to gauge, and it can shift during a game. And your capacity to understand when it's shifted is going to be what probably lets you take the game away. So you have to like figure out when to pressure. If you take a look at this round 3, board state between Sam and Shizzle, it's pretty hard to understand who's supposed to be the beatdown because Draven's in battlefield on Sam's side, and he has an overzealous fan on the board, so roughly like 6 to 8 might, and Shizzle has an equivalent amount of might, so another Draven and Tide Turner in base. The problem here is if you start looking at what's like around this, right? So what battlefields are they on? What cards have already been used? Like there's a Kaisa in the bin. Sam has like an extra treasure, which is going to matter a lot for Draven if you're stuck in like a mirror match. So, like in a mirror combat situation where Sam can, use that treasure and maybe get it back, whereas Shizzle has to like burn a rune, and you are on 6 energy, and Sam's Shizzle's on 2 energy open for probably something like Foff or Rebuke, more likely. So mirrors tax you by really asking you to find small edges between two decks that often will look almost the same. Now, the pure mirror match is when people are playing the exact same deck list with the exact same battlefields, and the battlefields are also mirroring probably, or there's like consecutive mirror, like you play Obelisk on one match and your opponent plays on another. But you're like pretty close to being like a perfect mirror. And in this case, what's most important is understanding what position you're in and what you need. So if you're Shizzle, you probably need things to catch up here or to push ahead of your opponent. And if you're Sam, you want to use the resources you have to like punish your opponent for being somewhat tapped out. So if you look at cards, you can start putting them in these buckets, right? When you're developing, you want to play out an early overzealous fan, push into a battlefield, or conquer with Kaisa and draw a card. And if you're winning, you're happy to like really punish your opponent. So you can like play Bryn Here Thundersong, preventing your opponent from playing any cards to defend themselves, and you can like foff their unit back or yours back if you're in a situation to protect it. If you're losing or you're at parity, you're often going to want to produce a card advantage. So stack deck is really essential when you're in a losing position to find the correct answers. But when you're at parity, it's also useful to find the right answers and to break card advantage parity. And I don't think I've seen a card that really breaks parity as much as Mind Splitter. I played a skirmish a couple weeks or months back where I got stuck into like 4 Yasuo mirrors back to back. And one of them really devolved into just who drew more Mind Splitters to break that stalemate. Now, there are also cards that fit into any of these buckets, and so you're happy seeing them almost at any time. Cards like Rebuke. I don't think I like Rebuke in a developing board state, but pretty much anywhere else I'm happy to see it, right? If I want to rebuke my opponent's big unit, that's great, like their first Forerunner. If I'm winning and I can rebuke whatever defensive unit they're trying to play, or to like break the pair, or like break into a battlefield, that's also great. And I can just like sit on 2 energy at any point. And if I'm at parity, I love Rebuke because it like will break that parity almost certainly. The main difference is if you're playing Rebuke from a losing position, you're probably playing it into a situation where you're like crippling your economy. And then if it gets countered by another Rebuke, or like you can't really produce enough value, then it's slightly less good in the losing situation than it is at parity or winning. But this is the kind of card I'm happy to see pretty much anywhere. And I could make similar claims for cards like Stack Deck, for cards like FOF, for cards like Called Shot. And realistically, I feel like a lot that's part of the reason why this color pair is so good, right? So when you look at your deck, one of the things that you can do is you can like print out one of these heuristics and you can literally try to figure out where your cards go. And once you understand that, you can understand what it is you're supposed to do at any given point during a match, especially if you understand what position you are in and what position your opponent's in. So yeah, mirrors are complicated. In general, they vary widely case by case because they're the most impacted by card variance, right? If I'm playing a perfect mirror with somebody and I draw badly and they draw well, then the mirror gets like really complicated. I'm already playing behind. I have to do certain things. But as a rule of thumb, and you can go back and watch my first video I've ever made on the channel to talk about pace of play. If you are playing in a mirror, you generally want to be the player that's playing slightly slower, not in terms of like clock time, but in terms of pace, because that means that you are the controlling player and you get to sort of produce a bit more value at all times. Now, if at any point you become the dominant player in that mirror match, then your opponent will want to slow down to like, get over you. And so a good example of this is, let's say I play Ferris Forerunner and my opponent plays Mind Splitter. So my opponent played a unit that was 1 mana bigger and 1 might bigger. They got a card over me, and now my Ferris Forerunner can't really do much to get over it. But the other way to approach the mirror match is to just be like way faster. So if your opponent is very slow and is trying to get to like Mind Splitter energy, well, you can just start playing small units and getting points and cards that they can't really react to. So everything in card games is really dictated about who is the dominant player, so who's the beatdown, and who is the sort of controlling player who has to slow down the pace of the game. It's also dictated by relative speeds, and it's dictated by like the variance of what you draw. And so for this reason, you have to also understand that some losses are due to different factors. So some are due to deck misalignment. And this is one of the hardest ones to deal with, because if you go to a tournament and you play something like Azir, and Azir is a very traditional aggressive deck, or very assertive fast mid-range deck, there's not much you can do aside praying to draw a rise as much as possible, and your opponent's going to try to like clobber you for doing that. Some of your losses are going to be due to variance. You're going to draw badly. It will happen. It is impossible for it to not happen, but you want to build your deck in such a way to reduce variance. Even then, it's still going to happen to you. And then the final one that I think is the most important and within your control is the one that is due to role misalignment. So understanding what it is they're supposed to be doing, and not playing slowly if you're playing a fast deck, or trying to outspeed your opponent if you're playing a slow deck. Variance is very hard to influence. You can influence it during the deck building, but not during play. However, Role misalignment you can have an impact in, and deck selection you can have an impact in roughly at 2 points during most events. One is before the event when you decide what to bring, and the other one is during side decking, where you can change your deck to match the pace of the opponent or to slow down slightly beneath it at any point. So yeah, this is really a topic that I think is becoming more important now that we're having a lot of mirror matches, that the metagame is concentrated around one hero. But to be quite frank, even if that wasn't the case and we were playing decks with incredibly different speeds, this would be super important. This is also why I think, for example, games like chess are so incredibly skill intensive. It's because they are effectively mirrors, almost perfect mirrors, that have produced like hundreds, if not thousands, of different strategies and scenarios for how to play. So yeah, good luck. If you are playing Draven, steel yourself for a lot of mirrors, at least for now. And if you're not, you have to understand how your deck is supposed to play around the speed that deck generates, and also for Miracle, right? These are like the two boogeymen of the meta currently. Yeah, again, I want to thank everybody for the subscriptions. It's been growing like crazy recently, and I'm super humbled. We're around 1950 subs, and when we hit 2K, I'm gonna be doing a mailbag episode. So I keep bringing it up just so that you like think about questions that you're interested in asking me. I answer what I can below videos, although recently my schedule's been really crazy. But I want to do an episode that's just for you, where I get to answer as many of your questions as I can. And that at this pace is looking like it's going to be sometime in late March, depending on how things go. Otherwise, we are now past the two regionals. So I hope they're going to have some interesting skirmishes, because I think those are starting up as of this weekend on my end. And I think we're pretty close to the Chinese national, so I'm going to be curious to see what happens there with the data that's been gathered throughout the Bologna and Vegas regional. And I think there's a bunch of other small like events. There's another CCS one I think coming up. So if you're participating in any of those, good luck. I hope this is useful to you, and I will see you next week. And I think next week, I'm going to start the week with an InFocus episode, given that I had to take off a couple of days to reorganize my entire, streaming situation. And I feel like it will probably be Lucian, but that's still up in the air. Otherwise, have a nice weekend. Enjoy the sun if you're in Montreal, and I will see you probably Tuesday.